My name is Leslie Burrell McLemore, and I'm going to be the moderator. And as the moderator, I have strict instructions. They told me to make my remarks brief, and I have said about half of what I wanted to say already. So I've worked that part. But this is on voting rights, one person, one vote. Clearly, given yesterday's election, we know that we still have a lot of work to do in Mississippi and in Pennsylvania and in Wyoming and Alabama. We have a lot of work to do in America because we have to make sure that we have the right to fully participate. So we have substituted voter ID for the poll tax, and we have to work on these issues this time. So what we're going to do is really examine. I'm not exactly sure what my panel members are going to say, but my guess is that somebody will mention Smith versus Allwright in 1944 that outlawed the white primary. I'm sure someone will talk about the return of the veterans after World War II and the impact that the veterans had upon the movement in Mississippi and the rest of the American South and the entire nation. People like in our state, our heroes and sheroes, including Amzie Moore and E.W. Steptoe and C.C. Bryant and Medgar Evers and Winston Hudson and Dovey Hudson, all of our sheroes and heroes who had an impact on voting in our state. And these sheroes and heroes were in place actually before SNCC and CORE and SCLC came to town in 1961 when SNCC started the Macomb Project, and we know that story of how SNCC got to Macomb and the role that Amzie Moore and C.C. Bryant and Ella Baker played in getting those people in place in Macomb. But this long history of voting rights, or the lack thereof, is an amazing story because you know that in Mississippi, we have the highest number of black elected officials of any state in the nation. And it is because of the hard work of so many of you, but also it's because we have 40% of our population is African American, more or less, probably more than less. But we have to get people registered to vote. So looking at Smith versus Allwright, moving forward, 1945, the role that the veterans played in the process. And then the Regional Council of Negro Leadership started in Mount Bayou in 1951 by Dr. T.R.M. Howard. And some of you who know our history know that people like Aaron Henry and Amzie Moore were leading lights in that organization, as well as members of the NAACP. And some of us who got our start in the NAACP back in the 50s and 60s remember the profound role that Medgar Evers played in this process, because in 1954, in addition to Brown versus Board, in addition to the founding of the White Citizens Council in Mississippi, we know that Medgar Evers was appointed the first permanent full-time field secretary with NAACP. So Medgar Evers influenced a lot of us in this room and some of us outside of this room in terms of getting involved in the movement. And he was about voter registration, he was about voting rights, he was about social justice for everybody in our state. So we are going to cover some of this territory, and I'm sure as we examine voting rights in the American South, in Mississippi in particular, we will cover some of this ground. But if you think with me about the coming of SNCC and the Macomb Project, and out of Macomb in 1961 with Bob Moses and a lot of other people, Marion Barry, Chuck McDew, the names go on and on, Bob Zellner here was a witness. And out of that project in 61, if we look at our recent Mississippi history, that is 50 years ago or less and more, that out of Macomb developed in 1962 the first black people running for the U.S. Congress since Reconstruction. Some of you know this story. Reverend R.L.T. Smith and Reverend Merrill Winston Lindsay. Reverend Smith ran here in this district, the 4th District, and Reverend Lindsay ran in the 2nd Congressional District. And these two individuals were working toward moving forward as we look at sort of the history of political participation. And some of you in this room participated in 1963 in the Freedom Vote campaign, in that mock election where Aaron Henry ran for governor and Ed King, who was the chaplain here at Tougaloo, ran for lieutenant governor. So looking at and thinking about the profound impact that Mississippi had upon the civil rights movement, and of course the acquisition of voting rights in Mississippi through the 1964 Civil Rights Act, then of course the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and the major role that all of you played in Freedom Summer, and that delegation that went to Atlantic City in August of 1964, and how that delegation helped to set in motion the coming, really, of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Most historians, because they've missed the story, they often concentrate just on what happened at Selma. But it was more than Selma. The MFDP was at Atlantic City in 1964, a year before Selma. And you know about the compromise. But you know part of that compromise was that moving forward in the future, the National Democratic Party would not seat a segregated delegation again. And by definition, part of that compromise led to this notion that in order to fully participate in the political system, you had to have the right to vote. You had to be, as we used to put it, you had to be a first-class citizen. And the only way you could be a first-class citizen is that you had to be a registered voter. So the foundation for the 1965 Voting Rights Act was there in Atlantic City and was there with the people who came from Mississippi to help transform this country. And of course, you can't think about and talk about Atlantic City without lifting up the name of Fannie Lou Hamer and the impact that Mrs. Hamer had on that process. So all those people that testified, that went to Atlantic City in 1964, they helped to deliver us where we are today. So again, let us remember these soldiers, these sheroes and heroes as we deal with voting rights issues on this panel. Now, they told me I had 3 minutes, and I think I've used about 2 minutes and 30 seconds, so I'm going to stop now ahead of the game. But you can see from your program, we have several people listed. Sherilyn Ifill is not going to be able to be with us, but Bob Zellner is, Bob is not only pinch hitting, Bob is a home run hitter.
That's right.
So
That's right.
Bob, the home run hitter, is, you know, Bob Zellner was, some of you reading the SNCC history, you know, Bob was at Macomb. He was the first full-time, I think, white person who was a SNCC field secretary of Macomb. He suffered some blows in Macomb. And you know, he comes from a very liberal Southern family before he got involved in the movement. So this is all great information. So, but I'm going to let Bob talk about Bob. And, but you know, right now, he's involved in North Carolina. And if you're on the SNCC listserv, you know that every day you get 4 or 5 missiles from Bob Zellner. Well, I'm sorry, at least 10. I'm sorry.
I hope.
But Bob is on the case, and he's working with the Reverend Dr. Barber and that great intergenerational crowd of people in North Carolina. So we're going to ask Bob to talk first, but let's give Bob Zellner a rousing round of applause.
I can use this.
Bob, you want to come over here?
Oh, I'll
you can
come
stand
over
up, and you can see your notes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. You're welcome, brother.
Thank you so much. I think you can hear the weather outside, but SNCC and CORE and NAACP and freedom fighters everywhere, brothers and sisters, enjoy storms. When the weather is upset and the politics are upset, that's when we get busy and that's when we get to work. I am Bob Zellner, and I was raised in L.A., Lower Alabama. And my liberal family that Leslie referred to is my daddy was in the Ku Klux Klan and my granddaddy was in the Ku Klux Klan. And in fact, Diane McWhorter did a book on George Wallace, and she said that the Klan was the left wing of the Democratic Party in the state of Alabama. So that shows you how far back and how far right wing my home state of Alabama was. But anyway, we don't want to dwell too much on the past because we have a lot of work to do. And whenever you see somebody that's only talking about what happened 50 years ago, they're not doing anything now. We're doing a lot right now, and I need your help. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of voting rights, which is what this panel is about, and you should at least talk a little bit about what the panel is about. We talk about the third Reconstruction that is now occurring. So therefore, we have to talk about the first two Reconstructions. The first Reconstruction being after the Civil War, when fusion politics took over in the southern states, and southern states passed some of the most progressive legislation that's ever been passed in this country, passed by poor white people in the South and poor black people, former slaves, and freedmen getting together in fusion politics. Now, that's happening today, and some of you may be surprised to learn that just February the 8th, a few months ago, the largest civil rights demonstration in the history of the civil rights movement in this country occurred in the South. 100,000 people gathered at the legislature in Raleigh, North Carolina, to try to turn back the right-wing takeover of North Carolina by the Tea Party and the Ku Klux Klan and the former Confederates who are still, well, people are still Confederates. Now, here's my problem, and here's what I need your help with. I talk all over the country and all over the world, and I ask people if they know what's happening in the new civil rights movement, and they say, what new civil rights movement? Do you know what's happening in North Carolina with voting rights and so forth? What's happening in North Carolina? Well, I want to tell you that 50 years ago, we in this room and we in this movement made a cultural revolution in the movement. And it's now time for another cultural revolution in the movement because we have a lot of established civil rights leaders who are making people in power feel comfortable. And the role of a civil rights leader, of a human rights leader, is not to make people in power feel comfortable. And I want to give you just a short bill of particulars that has everything to do with one person, one vote. Reverend William Barber, who spoke at the 50th anniversary of SNCC at Shaw University, is the president of the NAACP in North Carolina. They started 6 or 8 years ago building a coalition in North Carolina across all racial lines, religious lines, and movement lines. Whereas we had had silo politics and identity politics, Reverend Barber had the vision of putting together a coalition which now numbers 170 organizations covering every single progressive issue facing this country. And that coalition under the HKOJ, Historic Thousands on Jones Street, that's where the legislature is located in Raleigh, North Carolina, that coalition was the one that put together the biggest march in the civil rights history of the South, and that was just this February. One national newspaper publication covered that story, USA Today. Do you believe that the Washington Post didn't say anything about it? The New York Times didn't say anything about it? And that's only the tip of the iceberg. Reverend Barber, who has brought the North Carolina NAACP and this huge movement to the fore, was not allowed to speak at the national convention of the NAACP meeting in Orlando just recently. That was at the time that the Zimmerman, the decision came down in the Trayvon Martin case, exonerating and freeing Zimmerman. And the NAACP was meeting 20 miles away in Orlando, and they couldn't make it up to Sanford, Florida, to put in an appearance and protest that. And they spent half the night sitting up with the young people, talking them out of going there to put in a show, at least for the young people's NAACP. Well, this is the same revolution and the same struggle that we had in Mississippi, because Medgar Evers, as was just pointed out, was one of the first field secretaries for the NAACP. And we have still the same situation where Roy Wilkins was cussing Medgar every day. Medgar, quit taking those students down to the lunch counters. Stop those demonstrations. And when Medgar was martyred, all of a sudden, Medgar was the biggest martyr that the NAACP ever had. Now, the reason I'm talking about that is that we still have the same struggle. The NAACP is a huge, wonderful organization, and I want everybody who was ever in the movement or plans to be in the movement to please join the NAACP. We should all be members. It was here before the 1964. It was here then, did a lot of great work, and is still here. And is SNCC functioning? Is SCLC functioning? Is CORE functioning? No. It's an establishment of the people that's very important, but it's still a conservative organization because they were not allowed to have the grassroots organizing that was just like what we did 50 years ago come to the fore. So that's what I'm asking you to do. Help me break through the civil rights establishment and get some attention to what's actually happening in North Carolina, because it's spreading all around. It's going to happen anyway, and it would be a lot of help to have the establishment of the civil rights movement with us. So we're still doing the same things that we did 50 years ago. We're rocking the boat. We're rocking the cradle. Now, Reverend Barber was not only the one that not only kept off the stage at the National Convention of the NAACP, he was not allowed to speak at the 50th anniversary of the I Have a Dream speech. And Dr. Barber and what's happening in North Carolina is the best example, and what's happening here in Mississippi under Derrick Johnson is the best example of what Dr. King said in the I Have a Dream speech. The important part was to go back home and do the work at home. That's being done now, and it's being kept off the stage. The dream defenders, the young people, were given very short shrift at these national events. So this is something that's got to change. It's got to be a change. Ben Jealous, who has been a wonderful CEO for the NAACP, took it out of financial problems, put it on a sound basis and so forth, and done fabulous work. Just is doing a book now about the new third Reconstruction in the South. It was just written about. Chris Combs wrote a long piece on it, talking about what's happening in Mississippi, what's happening all across the South, where we're beginning to do voter rights again, and we're really going to take power in the South, which will change the whole country. And they managed to do that entire article without mentioning the NAACP or North Carolina or Reverend Barber. So why is this? It's because they're uncomfortable with uncontrolled grassroots organizing. But that's what's going to make the difference, because what the one percenters have done, and remember it was Occupy, the young people again, that called us and pulled our coat to the fact that over 25 or 30 years there's been an extreme redistribution of wealth in this country. So immense that the middle class is being hollowed out. People are being forced from the middle class down into the working class now, and that's always been a revolutionary situation. And it's not only in the United States that we're facing that. It's a worldwide problem. And I just read a statistic, and I have to research it, but someone said that 85 individuals own 40% of the world's wealth. 85 people. 85 private individuals own 40% of the world's wealth. Well, I still boggle at that statistic. But knowing what has happened here in the United States, I can see that it happens. And it has happened. And it happened under our watch. It happened under a black president, where we were lulled to sleep and not paying attention to what was happening to us economically. So that's what we're talking about today. And I love the panels and the talks this morning where Derek Johnson was talking about the vote is our currency. The vote is the way that we bargain for our own selves. So that's what we have to protect. There's a huge right-wing movement in this country, and it depends to great extent on using race and homophobia and anti-immigrant and anti-foreign and so forth. They use all of those issues to convince a fair portion of working people and poor white people across the country, especially in the South, to vote for the economic policy of the 1%. And it's been going on so long that as my white Southern people, are we that stupid that we would still continue to go down that road? I don't think so. In North Carolina, they have overplayed their hand. They've taken over the governorship, the speakership of the state house, the speaker and the leadership of the Senate, all three. And they have become so draconian that they pushed North Carolina from being the leader in education in the South to being 48th in the country. I can't even begin to tell you everything that's happening in North Carolina, but look at what's happening in North Carolina. Look at the voting rights struggle that has been going on forever. The first Reconstruction after the Civil War, when black people and poor white people got together and fusion politics reigned in the South, we had huge advances, and it was turned back with violence. The second Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, we've got great gains. We did away with the all-white ballot box. And remember, during Reconstruction, there was a lot of people that would tell you, we'll never go back to the all-white ballot box in the United States. How long did it take? By the end of the century, in one short generation probably, they turned that around. After the Civil Rights Movement, we said women's rights would never be challenged again. We'd never be forced back to all-white voting. All of those things are taking place now under the right-wing direction of the Koch brothers and our own Koch brother in North Carolina called Art Pope. They are doing that again, and they're doing it simply by getting working people and poor people to vote against their own economic interest on the grounds of race, anti-women, homophobia, and all those things. They are going to learn that their economic interest is with those people who have all of those similar problems. So Reverend Barber is doing it in North Carolina. We had over 1,000 people arrested so far. I was arrested April a year ago, and that made my 18th arrest, I think. And we all got bailed out. And just this past Monday, 15 people were arrested. That put us over 1,000 arrested. 300,000 North Carolinians demonstrating at the legislature. And can you imagine if 100,000 people marched on Jackson in Mississippi and 80% of them were white Mississippians? Would that make the news? You're damn right it would make the news. It should be making the news, and it's not, because this establishment, which includes a lot of our own civil rights leaders, are participating in keeping the lid on what's happening in grassroots organizing. We have 50 full-time young organizers now in North Carolina. I spent a week with them at Bennett College, training the organizers. 50 of them. Here in Mississippi, I know you have a lot of full-time organizers this fall. It's happening in North Carolina. It's happening in Mississippi. It's going to happen in Georgia. It's happening in South Carolina and Texas. We're going to turn those red states blue, and it's not an electoral strategy. It's a 6-year strategy to use voting rights, to get our rights back, and to teach people to vote for their own economic and social interests.
You can see Bob is still on the case. He's still working hard, and Tomorrow Monday is a model for so many of us in Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina and Louisiana and Arkansas and Texas, because we do recall that when the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed, we were in the streets. You do recall that when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed, we were in Mississippi Freedom Summer. So you have to get the attention of these people who make decisions in this country. Now, our next speaker is Judith Brown Dianis, and she has been working with counsel to Reverend Barber and Bob Zellner in North Carolina. She has been working on her organization worked on the voter ID case in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure she's working with other voter ID cases. They didn't give me a lot of background information on her, but she's going to tell us who she is, and let's give her a rousing round of applause. Come on.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So my name is Judith Brown Dianis. I'm co-director of Advancement Project, which is a next-generation multiracial civil rights organization. I am based in Washington, D.C. Important to me being here is that when we opened our doors 15 years ago, our work at Advancement Project was started right here in Mississippi. I learned how to be a community justice lawyer here from Hollis Watkins and Mike Sayer. I learned about how to respect community. I learned about putting community first. I learned about organizing. I learned about how the struggle of the people comes before what the lawyers think. And it was a good lesson that I have kept with me. And so it is important that I'm, here today, and especially because I got to see Mike Sayer after so many years. And for our organization, we look at this issue of voting rights as an issue of community organizing. This is about how communities tap into their own power, tap into their own voices as one instrument of their voice. And I have to say that it is, I will not talk about the history of voting because I cannot do that with my elders in the room, and especially because I see Taylor Branch in the room, and I would mess it up. So I'm not even going to go there. I instead will talk about the current situation because that's what I know about the best, and I don't have the footnotes to everything that they know. And so I want to talk some about the fight that we have today, because the fight that we have today is about the changing demographics of America. It is about the browning of America. It is about the fear that power may go to those who historically in this country didn't have power, shouldn't have power, were kept from power, were kept voiceless. And so the fight that we see today is about the scariness that some people have about the handwriting on the wall. The handwriting on the wall is that this is becoming a different country, that this country is becoming more inclusive. But there are those that want to fight against that because it benefits them to fight against that, because it actually might upset the apple cart for them if they have to give up some of their power. And so when we look at the voting rights struggle today, what we know is that voting actually is supposed to be, Election Day is supposed to be that one day where we are all equal. It doesn't matter if you are black or white or Latino or Asian or Native American, if you are rich or poor, if you are an elder or a younger or a middler like me. When you walk into the voting booth, we are all supposed to have the same amount of power.
Yes.
But there are those who said, actually, maybe we can change that script. Maybe we can do something to deprive people of that power. And so what we saw that was in 2008, there were a lot of people who got a wake-up call because Americans did something that no one thought could happen. I guess there were some people who thought, especially the candidate who ran for president, thought that he could win. I will say that I was one of those who, because I'm a civil rights lawyer and I work on the ground with grassroots organizations that are on the front lines of the struggle, I thought, he can't win. America's not ready for this. I work on issues around the school-to-prison pipeline. Young people are being criminalized every day. How can we get a black president when we are locking up our children at such alarming rates? We can't be ready for a black president. I remember my husband saying to me, he's going to win. You watch. I was like, yeah, okay. But Americans came together around a vision for this country. And so that happened in 2008. But then what happened was in 2010, all hell broke loose. Whoa. There was incredible backlash because people said, no, we are not ready for this. We had a temporary moment of insanity as a country, but we weren't ready for that kind of historical leap that could actually be transformational. Many people were not ready for the transformational part of what it may have meant to elect a black president. And so the backlash came in a sweep of legislatures across the country where Republicans got overwhelmingly elected. And in 2010, of all the years that they could have been ready to be in those positions so that they could position themselves to take over through redistricting, to be able to draw the lines, to divide the pie of power in ways that would keep them entrenched in power, not for 10 years, but maybe for 20 and 30 years. And so the backlash came swiftly. And then in 2011 and 2012, many of these states started to move to push for these laws that would make voting harder. Voter suppression, old school, just a new page in the old playbook. Let's see how we make sure that those black and brown people don't get access to the ballot again. Yes. And so what that meant was, how do we pass these ID laws? Now, some people say, ID, it's not a hard thing. You get on a plane. Well, for many people, 11% of Americans don't have ID. It's estimated about 21 million Americans that don't have it. For African Americans, the numbers are higher, about 25% of African Americans. If you think about places like New York City, African American males don't engage with the government in ways that permit them or require them to have IDs. In Wisconsin, where we did our voter ID case, there was a study that showed that 78% of African American males between 18 and 24 did not have the kind of ID that would have been required under that law. I said 78%. 50% of Latinos do not have the ID that was required under that law. And so the problem with voter ID wasn't just that it was ID, but it was very restrictive. It was a current state-issued photo ID with a signature on it, with this right address, couldn't be expired, and a lot of people move. And so while we had in federal law that you could show up to vote with your utility bill, because usually people don't go and set up a gas bill, a gas account, or an electric account in order to go commit voter fraud, that doesn't happen. Then you have to pay the electric company. Why would you want to do that? So people don't do that. So that's why we have a federal law that allows permissive kinds of IDs. But instead, these states decided to surgically craft laws that would impact the voters of color that they wanted to make sure didn't have a voice. And so we saw in Pennsylvania, voter ID passed. And you may remember there was a clip that was played on MSNBC a lot about this state representative Turzai, who said voter ID, check for Romney. They knew what they were doing. This was not about voter fraud. As we know, the biggest voter fraud is the fact that they say that there is voter fraud. In fact, what we know is that voter fraud is a solution without a problem, because in fact we know that in Pennsylvania, in our voter ID case, which Advancement Project and the ACLU did together, and we won, we beat down voter ID, the court actually said there was no evidence of fraud. So why are you passing these laws? In fact, President Obama's election commission which you may remember was actually a bipartisan commission, in their report recently said there's no evidence of voter fraud. So here we have this, Fox News narrative that's getting into people's heads. It's bubbling up everywhere about voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud, and we don't have it. So it was used as this trumped up idea to make sure that we could do something that would make it harder for people to vote. But they didn't stop there. What they also did was they cut back early voting. They cut back Sunday voting. They cut back Sunday voting because of souls to the polls, black churches getting together in caravans to go vote. And so they cut back early voting. In North Carolina, when they cut back early voting, there was one legislator who said, there's just some things you just don't need to do on Sundays. And one of that is voting.
Don't need to be voting on Sunday.
And so while we have these laws that are being passed in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Texas, Alabama, Mississippi, Virginia, we have North Carolina. And we have the Supreme Court. So before I get to North Carolina, Supreme Court in Shelby County case said, you know what? We're going to just put a dagger in the heart of the Voting Rights Act. We're not going to get rid of Section 5, which is the pre-clearance mechanism that says that anything from these covered states has to go to the Department of Justice to get pre-approved, but we're going to get rid of the formula, which means that basically you have made Section 5 ineffective. So what that means for us is that when we look at these cases, our problem is now that Section 5 was, number one, a deterrent. Number two, it was the ability to stop discrimination before it happens. Florida, 2000, I was counsel in a case on behalf of African Americans in the state of Florida. When they did that voter purge in Florida, where they cast a wide net to get rid of African American voters, had there been a Section 5 preclearance for that, we would have been able to stop it. When you stop these things, you can actually protect the outcome of an election. Elections are different than other kinds of things. If you don't stop the discrimination and it happens, you could get the wrong president by 536 votes. So the court gets rid of Section 4, leaving all of these southern states now open. And so what do we see? We see little things happening. We see big laws passed, but we see on the ground these election officials doing all kinds of dirty deeds. So one of the things that we actually passed out from Advancement Project, this is our step to protect your vote. If you are someone who works on the ground, here are the things that you should be looking for in the kinds of trickery that happens at the local level that can disenfranchise thousands, if not millions, of voters. And so these are the steps, these are the things you can look for. We say to people, you've got to go meet with your election officials. If we didn't learn anything from 2000, one thing we should have learned is that election officials have incredible discretion. There was a Secretary of State in Florida who had a whole lot of discretion. In fact, many people didn't even know what secretaries of state did until we met her. And when we met her, we realized that actually they have a lot of power. But not only at the Secretary of State level, but at the local election official level, where every day, I remember in Virginia, we had a local election official who was rejecting registrations of a group, that racial justice group, at about 70% of those forms. And it was because she said she didn't like the handwriting on the forms. And so it's that kind of discretion. In Ohio, you may remember a Secretary of State who said the paper of the registrations was too flimsy. It wasn't heavy enough. And he was throwing out any applications that came in. Secretary Blackwell, he threw out the applications because it wasn't heavy enough. So the kind of discretion that we have on the ground and the ability for community to use its organizing power to hold election officials accountable is important in this moment. We need to be meeting with local election officials all the time, calling them on the carpet. Right now, we know in many places what they're doing is moving polling places. Oh, you go to show up to vote, you've been voting in the same place for 20 years, all of a sudden it's gone. And there's a sign to tell you to go someplace else. You go to that other building, and in fact, you get there and they say, oh, stand in this line, but you went in the wrong line. And they say, oh, you have to vote by provisional ballot. Actually, you should have been in the other line, and now that you voted by provisional ballot, we're throwing it out. So these are the kinds of little things that voters are going through that are all of these little barriers. When you look at North Carolina, as Bob said, that was a movement that has been building for years. And what they were able to do was to get a very expansive election code where you had same-day registration during early voting. You had early voting. You had Sunday voting. All of these things that were built into the law. You had pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And what happened was when the legislature took over in 2011, they tried to pass voter ID. But in fact, there was a Democratic governor in place who vetoed it, maybe about 5 times.
Purdue, yeah.
And then one time they tried to override her veto in the middle of the night, in a midnight session. So, fast forward, 2012, she's no longer the governor, new story. New story means that when the Shelby County case came down, the voter ID law was percolating its way through the legislature. But when the Shelby County case came down was the day that they moved that voter ID law, but not only that, they added in getting rid of early voting, getting rid of same-day registration, getting rid of pre-registration, making it easier to challenge voters, which is intimidating to black voters in particular. And all of this, we call it the monster voter suppression law. And so we saw that when Shelby came down, the Texas AG tweeted within an hour, voter ID to move forward immediately. In North Carolina, they moved the law. In places like Virginia, where they had already passed their voter ID law, they held off on submitting it to the Department of Justice because they wanted to see what the Supreme Court would do. And they knew they had friends in the Supreme Court that would make sure that it was all taken care of. And so the things that we have to do in this moment is that the Voting Rights Act is the Voting Rights Act is supposed to be amended. There's an effort. There was a hearing today in the Senate. That's why Sherrilyn Ifill couldn't be here with us today. She was testifying in the Senate. That bill, for many of us, doesn't go far enough because there are many states that will not be covered under that bill. But we do have to fix the Voting Rights Act. The other thing that we have to do is that we have to go back to movement building.
All right.
I look at what has happened since I actually was on a panel at Congressman Lewis's panel at the Congressional Black Caucus, and I apologized to him. I apologized to him because I think that we have, I apologize to people who were here for Freedom Summer, because we haven't carried on the torch of continuing the movement to protect the right to vote. When we got the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Voting Rights Act, we left it to the lawyers. And I'm a lawyer, and I will tell you, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that. We have to be vigilant on the ground. The work has to happen on the ground to keep the movement going, because we know that the history of this country shows that voting is always a political football. Who gets to vote and who doesn't has always been about changing demographics in America. So I want to end with one thing. First, I would be remiss if I didn't say that if you see this document, and you see down here the email address, and you want to get on our mailing list, it actually should be votingrights@advancementproject.org. Please drop us an email, and we will put you on our email list so you can get up-to-date news. But I want to say just a couple of things, is that I remember being in a session with some elders, and there were 2 things I want to leave you with. One is that for those of us who are still in this struggle, that our work really is that we are in the business of reorganizing power structures. That's what we do. That is our task. And lastly, I want to end with a quote from Vincent Harding, who we all miss, who just recently passed. I had an opportunity to meet him for the first time just a few months ago in a meeting with the National Council of Elders, and I asked him if he would adopt me and I could be his daughter, and he said maybe my granddaughter, but that's okay. And so he said this. I am a citizen of a country that does not yet exist. Joy is in imagining what America could be and working towards that. Thank you.
Oh, oh, that was powerful, Judith. Thank you. Thank you very much. And she is from the Advancement Project. Now I know. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me point out that the incoming president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, his name is Lawyer Reverend Cornell Williams Brooks. And he is a political science graduate of Jackson State University. Oh, good. So this guy, he ought to have I should have his ear. So we're going to make sure that next go around, Reverend Barber, Dr. Barber can speak as long as he wishes. Yeah. But I'm surprised that they had the meeting and Reverend Barber was there. They wouldn't let him speak. And Bob, I'm surprised you didn't take the mic, and just force him to let him do it. Okay. We're going to have a robust discussion. We have about almost 45 minutes for questions and answers. And I think there's a microphone floating around in the audience. Is there a microphone? If not, I want you to speak loudly as you can, and we'll entertain questions and comments. Now, we have the last 10 minutes of our discussion. I'm going to ask all of us to think about next steps. They are recording this. Someone is taking notes. We have had some recommendations about building, movement building, but let's get some recommendations from you. What do you consider to be the next steps in ensuring that we have restored voting rights in this country? And we do have a roving microphone. Who wants to be the first questioner? Please, yes.
I have a very short question. You mentioned that there are going to be amendments to the Voting Rights Act, and I actually didn't know that. So I think it would be interesting to hear what they are.
Sure. So what they are trying to do is that there's the bill that is out now would adjust the formula for which, that would apply for Section 5. And what they would do is that it would have to be any place could be covered, so it's not just the southern places, not just the old places, if there were 5 violations, Voting Rights Act violations in 15 years. So what that means is that, especially for those of us who litigate these cases, that you have to have judgments, right? So we often settle these cases, like the 2000 Florida case was settled, so that doesn't count, right? And so each of these states are basically on a count, but what it means is that there are states like Alabama, which was the Shelby County case, that would not be covered under this new formula. But it also does open up the door to other places. It also does require that there would be notice of any changes to voting would be required, which is something new, and it would apply across the country. So for those of us who monitor elections, that is a good thing. So it's got some good things in it, but it also, the formula itself leaves several states in the South, in particular, out of the coverage, okay, including North Carolina, by the way.
Yes, sir.
Thinking specifically about North Carolina, it's an essential state in regards to the battle for the Senate. And what I'm wondering about is, what do you suggest we do? Not just where do we send our checks, but what can we do in North Carolina in the next few months, especially as the run-up to the election, if we have some free time and we want to get in our cars and go there?
Okay. Bob?
Okay. Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. I like practical questions, and what can we do when we go back home? There's a lot of things that we can do in North Carolina. We just had, as I mentioned, 50 young people trained to go throughout North Carolina. So I would get in touch with the NAACP or your local People's Assembly that's operating by the coalition of all the groups in North Carolina, and find out where those young people are and offer to fill them in on your local area. They want to know they're doing power structure analysis of the counties the way we did, office holders and things like that, so you could help right away. Some of them are still looking for housing maybe. If you're a member of a church, get them to get involved with the local organizer to please try to get to Moral Monday. There were another 15 people were arrested at the legislature just a couple of days ago, Moral Mondays. That puts us over 1,000 people arrested. And the next step in North Carolina, and if you want to participate in that, I'm sure you can. It's already been announced by Reverend Barber and all of the coalition partners, is a massive sit-in at the legislature. They've gone through all of the procedures of the nonviolent technique of wanting to negotiate, asking to meet, being rebuffed. They are now have been in the phase of civil disobedience, going to jail. The next step is jail, no bail. SNCC found out, and they found out a huge lesson here in Mississippi 50 years ago, that when the young people and the other people go to jail and stay in jail, the tactics are jumped up exponentially. So the parents get involved, the community gets involved. People are in prison for doing nothing more than singing and praying and petitioning the legislature. And specifically in North Carolina, it says the people have a right to assemble and to consult among themselves for their common good and to instruct their legislators. So we've won every case so far that we've been involved with. They've had to even throw out a lot of these thousands of arrest warrants and so forth. So there's something you can do. Also, take my, just Google me, get my email. My email is snickzellner@gmail.com. And I'll tell you who's active in your area. You can help them a lot because this is the future of the movement. When you have young people coming forward, and we have 50 from 35 to 18 that are now in the field in North Carolina. The same thing's happening here in Mississippi. There's a new civil rights movement, a new human rights movement that's building, and it's going to sweep the South and sweep the country in the next 6 years. It's a multi-year program. It's working with all of the professionals on the voting rights front, and it covers every single issue. So whatever your issue may be, in North Carolina, Reverend Barber never speaks alone from the stage. Is all of the people, and the people in Planned Parenthood may be talking about voting rights. The people who do voting rights may be talking about gay rights, LGBT issues, and so forth. The environmental people may be talking about, they could talk about coal ash in the rivers and Duke Power, but they'll also be talking about the right to education and the devastation toward to the medical establishment when they turned away health insurance and refused to expand Medicaid to 500,000 people. And they're devastating the economy of the state and turning away billions of dollars. So there's something to be done, and if you're willing to do it, you've got full-time work on your hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
I also wanted to add, to turn out to Moral Mondays is important. We also, on July 7th, will be the beginning day of our preliminary injunction hearing on the voting rights case, and it probably will be a 2-week trial that my colleagues will be taking in. We're representing the North Carolina NAACP, so you should keep an eye out for that. And we know we really need large turnout for all of that, those 2 weeks at the hearing.
And the Advancement Project has moved several people almost full-time into North Carolina, so we're mining their personnel for our organizers. They're some of the main organizers in North Carolina now. Ross Bellis and a whole bunch of people, Caitlin Swain, a whole bunch of people.
Great. Okay.
I think the panel's been wonderful, and I need to go to North Carolina, and I appreciate what you're trying to do
and
on repairing.
You better say your name so everybody knows who you are.
My name's Taylor Branch, and and your efforts to repair the Voting Rights Act. I encourage them too. And I worry about getting in the way of them, but I'm also worried that eventually, even if we repair it, it's limited. It pretends that the problems of voting are limited to the South and not even the whole South. And it also takes a model of trying to ban discrimination in voting. Mm-hmm. Is it conceivable for the long range that lawyers and thinkers could work toward a We the People amendment to the Constitution that says because we are the people is the linchpin of the whole thing, that all citizens are entitled to vote, and that Congress shall pass laws to make that easy and to encourage it, make it easy, make the vote count? Because right now we're trying to whack-a-mole on, and it seems to me that in the long run, a We the People country should have, as part of the Constitution, an affirmative right to vote rather than just trying to ban discrimination all the time. Does that make sense as a long-range thing to think about?
That makes total sense. That's our panel tomorrow on the constitutional amendment for right to vote. There's going to be a panel about it. At Advancement Project, that's one of our campaigns is around this issue. Because we think that we have to be bolder, we have to be more visionary, we have to make the Supreme Court understand that this is a right that should be protected just like we protect free speech and guns in this country, and that we really have to be able to have some national standards around voting also. So I agree. Unfortunately, I think one of our problems is that there are a lot of civil rights groups that don't believe that we should have a constitutional amendment. Some of those reasons are that they believe that it's implicit. We don't need to make it explicit. Some believe that we should just do the Voting Rights Act and use just that discrimination frame. Some believe it's too big and too bold. But I think that what we're going to find is that people around the country in small towns and hamlets and all of the organizing that is going to happen is going to push people to understand that that's the way that we have to go.
Thank you. Well, it does seem like if the demographics are going the way you described earlier, that these things are only going to get worse.
That's right.
And therefore we need to think bigger about a larger solution, perhaps.
Yep.
Thank you, Taylor Branch.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir. Clearly what we have heard in part is that we need to think about coalition building. We need to think about ways that we can replicate Moral Monday or Freedom Friday, but we need action and activity all over this country in order to change the laws that have really put us in the situation that we're in now. But let's give our panel members another rousing round of applause and thank all of you for coming.